Oh, sorry.
Yes, I did.
I think you're age discriminating here.
Age is, well, you're sexy too, Derek.
Are we recording? He's recording.
Oh, yeah.
That's all on record. No. So whenever you get lonely, you can put the Zoom recording. Oh, no.
Paul, I need to hear your voice. You should try prison.
No, don't think you should.
So last time I did talk about this painting. We've seen Kurt Wenner chalk art before, and this is just another example of his work and the detail that he's able to put into these sidewalk kinds of paintings. And one aspect that I want to just briefly touch upon is the perception in his type of artwork, which is not what we traditionally see, certainly in terms of most fine art. It's called anamorphic perspective or projection, and it gives this, depending on where you're looking at it, it gives an elongated kind of perception from this. And this idea about anamorphic perspective goes back to basically Leonardo da Vinci, and an example of it that shows how the perspective of an eye can be distorted, elongated, depending on how you view it. So initially it looks very elongated, somewhat, more so than the Kurt Wenner artwork, but as you change your orientation to it, it now becomes a regular eye. Okay? So to an extent, that's what Wenner's used to try and generate some of the three-dimensionality that he has by using this kind of projection or perspective, which is obviously a classic kind of aspect for various types of artwork. So just to move on now to the horror study. So the idea here is to try and understand whether or not the physiologic response that we see today with regard to atherosclerosis and coronary artery disease, is this something that is truly inherent in our physiologic system, or is it due to changes that have occurred over a period of time? Are our cells now more prone to atherosclerosis? Are our diets uniquely generating this type of cardiovascular event? And so what people have done, this is one study using Egyptian mummies. So going back about 5,000 years to see whether or not individuals at that time showed the same degree of atherosclerosis calcification as we see today. There's been other studies using indigenous populations around the world, generally not as old, though, as the horse study. So what they essentially did is they took mummies, and look for calcification. So that's a stage, end stage kind of alteration when we have atherosclerosis. It's something that you can pick up with high degree of imaging with certain types of CT scans. And so, whereas you wouldn't see, fat deposits after 5,000 years, you will see deposits of calcium within the vasculature. And so, the question is, okay, how do the vascular systems of the Egyptians 5,000 years ago compare to Egyptians of today? And so, what they did was basically count or look for calcified vascular beds. And if you looked at the current population in Egypt, you have, again, depending on the age of the individual, increasing number of vascular beds in which you see some level of calcification. The older the person, the more the calcifications that you find. When we look at the ancient Egyptians, it's to a first approximation about the same. Okay, an increasing number of calcified vascular beds as they aged, although the age populations is not identical. The interesting thing about this as well is it's felt that these individuals who were mummified and essentially put in places that, thousands of years later, somebody could, in fact, find them, are probably the ruling class of that time, so they have a tendency to have richer diets, things of that sort. So it's felt that their diet probably was as atherogenic then as it is now. And it's showing that biologically our vascular system hasn't changed all that much. That what is occurring now is more or less inherent in the way that the vascular system has been put together. So, as we talked about last semester when talked about lipids in clinical chemistry, and you'll be seeing some of the same slides again, so hopefully that'll reinforce that when we start developing atherosclerotic plaques, they tend to occur at areas where there's some type of turbulent flow, or at least higher shear stress on the vascular endothelium. So again, where there's bifurcations, where there's sharp turns, things of that sort, that's where we're going to see the initial change in the endothelium that'll lead to the production of an atherosclerotic plaque at that location. Once we have this change, then we seem to have accumulation of lipid that starts with it a macrophage dependent change in cellularity, and those macrophages in this area with lipid deposition transition into so-called foam cells, which are the characteristic cells of atherosclerotic plaques. So we get this progressive change in the first the change in the endothelial, some dysfunction there. We start to deposit lipid. We end up with macrophages moving into the area because of this alteration in the vascular wall, which of course they're looking out for any kinds of changes in structural features, and we get the foam cell formation. With that, proliferation of smooth muscle cells, a change in the how thrombotic the endothelium is, and we end up with these fibrous plaques. If they go on in terms of, there's a continual deposition of lipid, accumulation of more foam cells, we'll start to see calcification occurring. So, in terms of a coronary vessel, as we're going to transition from something that looks like this to first a thickening. Most of this thickening you see here is smooth muscle cells, some degree of certainly foam cells in involvement here, and then the calcification, the deposition of calcium here, and the closing of the lumen until finally the coronary artery is totally occluded. Non-calcified plaques are not that stiff, okay? It's when you get calcium going in is really where the stiffness starts to occur. So this progressive calcification till you get a real, basically hard calcified deposit is going to be much more prone to blockage and the activation of clotting on the surface than these softer plaques. And some of these softer plaques can even regress. So in this particular diagram, as we go from left to right, increasing levels of calcification, and as we do that, increasing cardiac mortality, because the rigidity of these makes it more probable that you're going to get complete occlusion of that particular artery. And of course, if it's one of the major perfusing arteries, then you have the potential for sudden cardiac death. Yes?
Is there a correlation between calcium buildup in the vessels and osteoporosis? I mean, where's the calcium coming from? Is it coming from the bones?
So the indirectly it will. So the question was, is there a relationship between calcification of these plaques and reducing bone density as a mechanism for calcium being extracted? The amount of calcium in these plaques relative to the amount of bone calcium is quite small. So even though it may be a significant deposit, it's in the generally microgram to possibly milligram level compared to the grams of calcium in the bone. So for the most part, you don't have a significant drain on bone calcium. It's just circulating calcium that is easily replaced by nutritional calcium. So when you start to form these atherosclerotic plaques, be they calcified or not, to try and treat these, the development of these plaques, we're going to try and essentially reduce risk factors. So all of those things that contribute to at least the progression of this, including hypertension, hypercholesterolemia, comorbidities like diabetes, all those things you try and control. And medically, the other thing is to try and reduce lipids as much as possible, generally with statins, but there are other classes of lipid-lowering drugs too. If you do have an individual that has significant plaque formation in the coronary arteries, then you may have to do some kind of interventional therapy. And what is done most frequently are the stent placements. The interventional radiologist can thread a stent into a coronary artery and open it up. In those situations where the clot is, or the plaque is so extensive and calcified, you can't get a stent into that area. So that's when bypass surgery is used to basically just get blood flowing around that particular block. So there are all sorts of procedures in terms of coronary bypass surgery. Most of them are looking at adding a saphenous vein graft, which is a redundant vein from the leg that you can then connect either to the, a lot of times not to the aorta directly, although that's what's being shown here, just because of the high flow. Try and go to something maybe a little bit smaller diameter, doesn't have quite the flow and the pressures associated with it, but yet has lots of oxygenated blood going to it. And then, like that left internal mammary graft, where again a saphenous graft is being used. And then you can connect it if you have block in the left coronary artery, in the LAD, something of that sort, you can bypass around it. And you'll see in vascular surgery schedules and things of that sort in hospitals where a person will have a coronary artery bypass graft, CABG, and they'll say 1X, 2X, 3X, 4X, 5X, 6X. That's how many bypasses they're doing. They're actually bypassing, say, 5 different blocked arteries in a 5X CABG. And generally, it's successful in terms of maintaining patency in these arteries once you've done the bypass surgery. Stent placement has really revolutionized the ability to open up these arteries without doing significant surgical procedure, since all of this is done through the vasculature, threading in a catheter, getting it into the coronary artery, and then expanding the stent. So the stent goes in as a collapsed version on the catheter. You get it into the appropriate location, and it pops open and pushes back the plaque material, and essentially now produces a new lumen. So clearly, a real calcified plaque, you can't do that. It just doesn't move out of the way, and that's why you have to do a bypass kind of procedure. The material in the that's been pushed back, the plaque material will be covered up. The stent will be endothelialized, and with time, it'll become incorporated into the wall of that particular artery. The biggest issue with these stents is basically reclotting, or clotting that can occur because of the stent material, even though it's non-thrombogenic, or as least thrombogenic as we can do it. And now what people, really for a few years now, is they will incorporate anticoagulants into the stent material itself on the surface, which will essentially prevent clotting in that area, inhibit clotting until the stent and everything gets endothelialized, and with it now a cellular barrier to clot formation. So I think I mentioned this again last semester, but just to put in a little bit about the pathology that you'll see with this familial hypercholesterolemia associated with the French-Canadian deletion. This is, again, cholesterol levels that are 500 to 1,000 milligrams per deciliter because they don't have the LDL receptor to pull the LDL out of the blood and maintain normal cholesterol distribution. The amount of cholesterol is impressive to the point that it many times starts to accumulate in tissues, and we'll start to see these xanthomas, and those are basically just lipid deposits. They'll tend to form again, in peripheral tissues. There's partially due to temperature differences of the vasculature and the ability to basically partition into the tissues. But when you start to see this, there's a lot of cholesterol in that individual. And so these people clearly have much elevated risk for atherosclerosis. Myocardial infarctions in their 30s and 40s are not uncommon because of all this lipid around. So, any questions about that before we go on to myocardial infarction? Okay. So myocardial infarction, basically some interruption in blood supply to the myocardium such that we have cell death occurring within the myocardium syncytium. So most of these are due to coronary artery disease, okay, where we have some kind of reduction in blood flow to the myocardium. But there are other causes for this, although they are, for example, arrhythmias, where we have change in the normal pacing of the heart, particularly if you have something like a fibrillation, an atrial fibrillation or atrial flutter. The atrium is, kind of churning the blood inside, so it has a potential for activating blood coagulation. And with that, those small microclots can migrate into the coronary artery, build up in a particular location, and block that particular perfusing artery. So the arrhythmia is basically a mechanism for enhanced clot formation. So those individuals that are, have atrial fibrillation, they're on anticoagulants to try and prevent that kind of sequelae. Coronary artery disease, again, plaque formation, diabetes, an independent risk factor, but certainly contributing to the formation of atherosclerotic plaques, and certain types of changes either in the heart itself or in the vascular supply. Idiopathic hypertrophic subaortic stenosis, we talked about aortic stenosis. This is just a version of that in which it's not, nobody knows exactly why the stenosis occurred. It wasn't a congenital problem, and so that's why it's idiopathic. And hypertrophic because the left ventricle is going to hypertrophy in response to this increased pressure. And again, when it's hypertrophying, the potential is for less perfusion of some of the myocardium, and with that, the potential for an MI. So in terms of myocardial infarctions, it'll depend on the perfusing vessel as to what type we'll see. So transmural is the more extensive type of infarction, and in this case, it's transmural. It's across the entire myocardium, across the entire, say, of the left ventricle, which would be the worst kind of MI, because now you have dead muscle on the vessel that is going to be providing cardiac output, and as that muscle degenerates, you have the potential for ballooning out of the tissue and even potentially rupturing of that. So transmural across the entire muscle wall. Subendocardial, these are the kinds that occur, you're perfusing, say, some of the papillary muscles, maybe the ventricular septum, something of that sort, and you plug up one of those vessels, and so you end up with damage to the muscle, but it's not throughout the entire myocardial wall, or like a transmural is. So these subendocardial tend to be those areas that are kind of at the end of the arterial vascular system. So they're kind of at the end, so they're a little bit susceptible. You'll plug it up and you'll have a very focal kind of damage, so subendocardial. So this is the worst kind. So where this spear, so it's a little plastic spear that's been put, that you can see the muscle has all degenerated right at that point. So clearly this is an autopsy, because the person had essentially a blowout of the left ventricle. There's no, at that point in time, cardiac output go to zero. And so you can see lots of damage, lots of degeneration that occurs. So a transmural, in this case left ventricular myocardial infarction, versus a subendocardial infarction. So here we have a complete section through the left ventricle area, and here's our subendocardial infarction right in here. So it doesn't, there's viable muscle all the way around it, and for the vast majority of the ventricle, it's a viable tissue, but there are some degeneration that you're seeing in one location. So this kind of infarction sometimes will not be recognized, that the person will have no symptoms from. And with time, it'll just scar over. And there may, however, be some changes in electrical conduction pathways and some things of that sort. So you may have some consequences from it, but for the most part, the heart is able to adjust to this damage. One thing that is notable about these infarctions is that initially the histology doesn't look too bad, even in a transmural. You'll start to see some degeneration maybe in the 24 to 48 hour period of time. It's not until you start to get out for a few days, if the person is able to survive that long, depending on the MI, that's when you start to see the inflammation really getting started, and you start to get damage, breakdown of the myocardium, and it's a time where if we had a way to control the magnitude of the breakdown of the tissue, we could basically reduce the end game in terms of how much damaged tissue there is. And that's what a lot of people are looking at this point in time, is to, once you have it, assuming that you've done the different therapies and things of that sort to try and reduce the risk of it, but once it occurs, you try and reduce the magnitude, because this is a condition that kind of gets bigger with time until hopefully the body is able to start to reduce the inflammatory damage that's being caused by this inciting infarction. So symptoms of an MI, classic symptoms: shortness of breath, palpitations, sweating, nausea. Slight differences in terms of males and females with regard to females do not tend to have much in the way of this radiating pain down the left arm. Females will tend to have substernal pain, and so it's always mentioned that the presentation is a little bit different between genders. 25% of MIs are silent. There are no symptoms, or the symptoms are so mild that the person doesn't really connect it to a problem. They might think that they have a little indigestion or something of that sort. So diagnosis of an MI. So the pain needs to be constant for at least 20 minutes. And because there are a fair number of people that don't have too many symptoms, that's not generally one of the significant criteria, but it is one that's used medically. But changes in serial ECG, cardiographic, these echocardiograms, these are transthoracic. And then, as we talked about last semester, serum enzyme levels, particularly troponin levels, and creatine kinase MB as diagnostic for myocardial damage, which is essentially hand in hand with a myocardial infarction. So you'll see ECG changes, you'll see troponin levels ordered, not as much the creatine kinase anymore as it used to be, because the troponin levels now are much more reproducible, and that'll be your diagnostic criteria. So I already mentioned that arrhythmias are a risk for MIs because of the generation of blood clots, and anytime that a person is diagnosed with an ongoing kind of arrhythmia, be it fibrillation or some type of reentry kind of phenomena that is not necessarily fibrillation, but just something that's going to start to churn the blood because of the change in the normal pacing of the heart, is going to be a potential inciting for small clot formation within the heart itself. There it is. So what's that sign that is general in terms of a myocardial infarction that we tend to see in females compared to males? So we'll see that indigestion, substernal pain, much more commonly in women than we do see in men. And so we'll see a number of different ways or processes that the vasculature is injured within the coronary circulation. And basically they are the same that we'll see in the general circulation to disrupt endothelial function and end up with a surface that is much more prone to clotting. So, inflammation, the amount of cholesterol, primarily because that's a promoter of the process, not an instigator per se. The generation of reactive oxygen species, and potentially homocysteine and its role in terms of producing these changes in the vessel wall. So nonspecific vascular inflammation has been one area that has been controversial in terms of its ability to really drive atheroma formation and subsequently myocardial infarctions. But there is an association that has been found between individuals that have high circulating C-reactive protein and myocardial infarction. The controversy is that even if you reduce CRP levels, okay, so remember CRP is one of the acute phase reactive proteins made by the liver in response to IL-6, IL-1 to an extent, that if we're seeing this C-reactive protein circulating, then presumably we have some inflammation going on someplace. And if it's in the vasculature, then we tend to see high levels or an increased risk for myocardial infarction. The reverse is not true. That if you have somebody that has high C-reactive protein levels, if you do something to reduce them, you don't see a population-based reduction in myocardial infarctions. So, does it have a role? Maybe yes, maybe no. CRP, remember, that's one of those proteins that binds to cell surfaces for dying cells. We get activation of the complement system, and you can make a good argument as to why that should produce myocardial infarction if it's in the coronary artery beds. So there have been some studies, and the one that's the longest term one, looking at can we reduce myocardial infarction risk for those people that are at risk because they have elevated CRP levels. Can we give them an anti-inflammatory agent and see if that reduces the risk, see what happens. So it's a long-term study. It's a 5 to 10 year study. This one was funded by the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute of the NIH, and they used methotrexate as the anti-inflammatory agent, not an NSAID like aspirin or something of that sort. And there's a number of reasons for it. The results are just starting to come out, and they look very mixed. They haven't finished it off because, again, it's such a long term in terms of trying to reduce risk factors for myocardial infarction. So vascular inflammation due to unknown causes, does that contribute to myocardial infarction? Well, maybe. come back in another 5, 10 years, we'll talk about it, okay? But right now, I guess we'll do a quiz. That's what Dr. Phipps tells me to do. I do whatever he says. Yes.
For our exam on Friday, is that going to include tomorrow's material as well, or just
Tomorrow's.
tomorrow's as well?
Yeah. So if you would spread out so they have an empty seat on either side of you.
Share a chair.
Yeah.
We need a calculator?
Are there any equations?
No. Just keep the quiz face down until everybody gets a copy.
I know. That's why I told myself last.
This is the only place I got one in.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Yes, once or twice.
Why would you do that?